Okay, so Pablo, thank you for taking the time to talk to me and the students at the University of Waterloo today. I thought we'd start just by asking you to describe the job that you've got with the UFCW.
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you and the students. I think it's a great initiative to start understanding a little bit more about what it is when it comes to fighting for the rights of workers in any space. As you mentioned, my name is Pablo Godoy, and my work with the United Food and Commercial Workers Union really is about finding the ways and mechanisms to support people at work in precarious industries. And mostly what we're seeing today, that precarious work is translating into what we might define as digital work or on digital platforms. And it's to that end that I am the national coordinator for gig and platform employer initiatives.
And potentially an awful lot of people who you're going to be representing.
Absolutely, and that's the goal, right? Is to start looking at models that might be able to respond to the needs of workers that work in that digital space.
And so I thought for those people who are less familiar with it, we'd just start with an explanation of what the gig economy is. Can you just give people a quick description of what that's all about?
Absolutely. I think that the term gig economy or sharing economy is one that gets interchanged. Ultimately, there's not necessarily one sole definition, but there are some defining characteristics to the gig economy. Really what that points to is workers that are working part-time, casually, temporarily, on temp or through temp agencies. Really, it really demarcates or really points to what people refer to as the casualization of labor. What I mean by that is at some point in time, work and jobs really were meant to be full-time, were meant to be paid well, and were meant to align with cost of living and affordability. At some point that started changing over the decades. Today that's been accelerated by employers' general desire to have cheaper labor, and the way that's really found is through people getting work that's through contract, by being deemed as contract workers rather than employees, and I'm sure we'll get into what that differentiation actually means for people. But really it's about creating small short-term employment models that may or may not come with the same level of protections that traditional employer-employee relationships used to have.
So we're talking often about people who are low paid and have very little security of employment or benefits and things like that. Mm-hmm. One big employer, obviously, of gig workers is Uber, and you've been leading the UFCW's work to organize Uber workers. Can you tell me what it's like to be an Uber driver? What sort of conditions do they have?
Well, I can certainly speak to the conditions of the workers that we're working with. I mean, I think if you speak to Uber drivers, each one might have a slightly different experience that might range from a positive and super good experience to the quite opposite. And so it's important to illustrate that, because we know that these platforms provide opportunity for some, and lost in that opportunity sometimes are the missteps or the inability to access meaningful protection. And that's what we're finding with the drivers that we're working with. Specifically, our union is working with a group of drivers that service the Toronto airport and the downtown core, that operate on one of the various tiers of Uber, and that's specifically the Uber Black tier. They have a set of specific conditions for their service, and that's that they have to be limo drivers, they have to possess a limo license, they have to have commercial car insurance, and the rules that Uber sets out in their app actually dictates quite a few more requirements for their vehicles, the condition in which they are, and a couple of other characteristics that define them more closely to employees. At the airport specifically, in order to actually service the airport, drivers have to queue or wait in a line that's really surrounded by a geographic fence, right? That's what we would geolocation that they have to be idling in to be able to receive a ride through Uber Black at the airport. The problem with that, or the complication, is that the riders aren't being told where they fall in that queue. So there may be 300 drivers at any given time in this geographic zone, not knowing where they stand in the queue, not knowing if they're next or if they're last, without access to, in this specific case, an area for a rest, or an area for a break, or an area to use a washroom facility. And so in order to access those things, these drivers have to leave that physical space. for us, it's problematic because that shows the conditions that are being set out in a way that is limiting to the drivers, in a way that obligates them to spend hours on end without knowing when they get that ride. And so one of the issues at first that came to the fore was that they wanted a bit more transparency. I'd like to know whether or not I'm 2 hours away from receiving a ride, whether it's worth staying here or whether I should be going to another area to pick up rides. And that information is limited in terms of access to drivers. There was a couple of other issues, though, that came up, and that's specifically when they had issues with a customer that may have been abusive or problematic. They were sending emails and messages to Uber head offices, and many of them were going ignored or not answered. We've had several drivers show us an array of attempts to communicate with the company itself, whether it was a condition of health and safety, a driver being rated poorly because they wouldn't do maybe do a maneuver on the road that they were being asked to do, whether that's idle in a place that has no idling and risk getting a ticket for doing so, whether that's doing a U-turn in an area that there is no U-turns permitted. All these things often come at the risk of being rated poorly. And a poor rating for specifically most drivers, but them more than anybody else on the black tier, can lead to you being deactivated because you require, I believe it's a 4.82 rating to service the airport and to actually be operational on the Uber Black tier. So while rating systems can be seen as a great thing for the user, ultimately they come with great risk because you're not able to regulate them and make sure that a poor rating is done so in a fairly manner that the person that loses their job, and we saw a lot of people being deactivated unfairly, and perhaps even more problematic is that when they were rated unfairly, or even if it was a poor rating, there was no real recourse to actually investigate or to be reactivated. And so what you're really doing is shutting people off from their ability to make work, to make a living, which actually has a larger consequence. It literally is about people being able to put food on their plates, having their kids have food or be able to go to school or afford the basic necessities that you need. And so a couple of these issues were raised with Uber. Uber wasn't responsive, and so the drivers themselves got together and said, we need a bigger and larger voice, somebody that might have a little bit more cachet or be able to get Uber's attention. And that's when they came to us, and resoundingly they signed union cards. Resoundingly they showed up to vote in the first ever union vote for RideHailing Services in Canada, and we're currently now awaiting the results of what will be a series of Labour Board hearings.
Okay, and as part of what you're doing to organise them, you've formed something I think called Uber Drivers United. And can you talk a bit about the work you're doing to organise Uber drivers?
Absolutely. So the first thing that we try to do in any, we call it organizing drive, and an organizing drive really means bringing workers together in a workplace who want to exercise their rights. And so with Uber Drivers United, the campaign is really about uniting Uber drivers, bringing them to one central space so that they can have a little bit more coordinated efforts when it comes to either launching a campaign, whether it comes to actually trying to poll or understand what the main issues are. And so we've done a lot of work with the thousands of people across Canada that work for Uber that have signed our union cards and have signed up for more information. We've been able to contact them and poll, ask them questions and survey them about, what are the main issues. And often they're about unfair rating systems, they're about not being able to be heard, about not being able to be reactivated when deactivated, about not being able to have any access to any real support when it comes to health and safety issues or concerns in the workplace. And so United really stands for trying to bring them together and coordinate first the collection of some information so we understand the realities that they face, but also second to that is that we don't want to take any action on their behalf that they don't fully support, whether that's lobbying efforts or whether that's unionizing a specific area or zone. And so the campaign itself is meant to firstly bring them together, secondly get some information together collected in a meaningful way, and then be able to represent a certain portion of the drivers that are wanting to unite for those rights.
Hey, thank you, and it's very useful to talk to you because you're giving a very clear, practical understanding of the impact of a platform gig type employer. Looking beyond Uber, how is the gig economy impacting workers inside other areas? So could you talk a little bit about gig work in other sectors?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, a certain, I think, clarification needs to be made, and that's that employers, big businesses, have traditionally always tried to find new means of reducing costs ultimately they're set up to create and make bigger profits. To that end, there were, historically we've seen that they try to get creative with whether that's, paying minimum wage or trying to pay the least amount possible for most amount of work being done. With that, the rise of gig economy, or the rise of contract work, really goes hand in hand with that. It's about finding ways to pay less for the same labor. And the rise of gig economy work really has done that. It hasn't really changed much of the work being performed, so the actual task that's being done by workers, but what's being changed or challenged is the employer-employee relationship. What used to be somebody got hired, was my employee, now works in my shop, has become mediated by a third-party application, something like Uber, something like TaskRabbit, something like Lyft. I'm sure you could name thousands of these apps now that in any industry you can access labor through these mechanisms and put them to work. So the work hasn't changed. What has changed is that employer-employee connection, and what's really being done when you ignore that traditional employer-employee relationship, and by that I mean being called an employee, you lose the protections and you lose the laws and you lose what historically has been established to make sure that every worker in the workplace in Canada has a baseline of protections. That baseline of protections are things like making sure that you can't be forced to do unhealthy or unsafe work. That baseline of protections is one that guarantees people a minimum wage, because if you don't establish a minimum wage, which I have to remind people is the least legal amount that an employer can pay you. So that means if it didn't exist, there's a big chance that many employers would be paying much less if they could. And so the circumvention of those labor laws that really are meant to just create a baseline is being done at a click of a button. And so the disruption is much more than just changing how companies get their labor. It's how people are protected at work. And now people say, well, people shouldn't work for these apps if they don't want to. The reality is many traditional industries are being changed so that the vast majority of jobs in those industries are being accessed through these apps. And so that really has a large impact when it comes to somebody's ability to make more money, for instance, because most of these applications take a surcharge in between. So take Uber, for example, they'll take 30% of that ride right off the bat. If you're performing any other service on any other platform, the way they make money generally is by charging the user and charging the service provider some fee. And so not only are they breaking the traditional employer-employee relationship, they're also inserting themselves as somebody who's going to make money off of this transaction, and thus taking away a couple of things from the employee, the worker, their ability to make sure they're protected, but also social protections, right? So everybody that's an employee makes the deductions like their pension, like employment insurance, and while if you don't use them, you might not like them, sooner or later in life, when you go to retire, it's good to know that you've made your pension contribution so that you have a pension. Or if you lose your job, that you have employment insurance so that, the time period that it takes you to find another job, you have a social protection. And these are things that are there for a reason. And some people say, I'd rather not pay them. And mostly that's because you've never needed them. But as soon as you need them, you sure are glad that you've paid into them. And so that's really what's being disrupted. We're seeing that I think at last glance, over 3.5 million people in Canada are participating in the gig economy, whether that's working or getting the services. And so it's really changing the landscape of work in many industries. And with it, really changing the dynamic of how people make a living and whether or not they're able to make a living.
You've been concerned about it, particularly in supermarkets and distribution centres as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Sure, absolutely. So historically, if you take a grocery store or an employer like that, they might have looked at growth, whether that was delivery services, whether that was stocking shelves, whether that was creating a new department in the store. They'd see it as a natural growth of their business, and they'd hire more people like they'd hire traditionally. What's happening now, though, is they're trying to create, whether it's delivery, whether it's personal shopping services, they're doing so by trying to use this technology, these applications, that they very well could create the same technology and employ people in the same way and have the same convenience offered to customers through the push of a button. But they've come to know that by using this technology, the people that provide the service are no longer deemed employees. In our workplaces, that means people are no longer offered good paying union jobs that generally pay more than minimum wage, that are often, overseen by contracts, and contracts that have great rules involved with them, whether that's a premium to work on Sundays, whether that's flexibility for your schedule, whether that's you're a student and you take 3 or 4 or 6 months off to study. There's language in these contracts that make sure that your jobs are protected. And so where we used to see traditional employment be what was used by companies in the grocery or food sector, now they're trying to use these tools to provide you personal shopper services, personal delivery services. But again, what we say is these are jobs that could be offered in the same way as traditionally done. But what we've seen is a change in, rather than create the jobs like they used to be, the cutting of costs. And so the dangerous part for us is that you end up having a store, for example, that employs very similar people doing the very similar job, doing in the exact same place, only being paid and treated drastically differently. And what we think is that's unfair. And I don't think it's unreasonable for people, human beings, to want to be treated fairly and have the same level of wages or benefits. And this isn't about, a race to the bottom, that you shouldn't do something just because it's bad. People that do these jobs are because they need work and they're looking for work.
Do you see any benefits from the gig economy for workers? I mean, at the beginning of our discussion, you mentioned that some people are reasonably keen on this type of job. Are there benefits there that workers get from a gig job?
I mean, I think there's some inherent benefits that people see in the gig economy, whether you're working in the gig economy or whether you're accessing these services, whether it's convenience of access to services, goods, or whatever it might be, whether it's perceived convenience that you are able to work whenever you'd like and when you don't. And I say perceived because in some cases, turning on your app and waiting hours on end isn't necessarily working when I want, right? I still need to wait for whenever a ride, for example, is sent my way. And I say that, and there might be people listening saying, well, that's, how could he say something like that, because everything's based off of geolocation. And a lot of our research, especially with Uber, is showing that it's not just geolocation, that there's other factors that are involved, whether that's the rating system, whether that's a new driver, because we know that new drivers are often offered a specific amount when they first join the platform. And our question has been to Uber many times, how can you ensure that amount if your algorithms are based off solely geolocation? And there's some cases worldwide that have exposed the fact that the algorithm is not just a geolocation work provider. And so it's important to understand that, right? The Uber drivers at the airport, quote unquote, choose to work 14 hours to idle, but they only get 3 or 4 rides a day. So this concept has to be challenged a bit. Having said that, it is certainly convenient to be able to either top up your wage or be able to work in a way that allows you to, say, take your kids to school, then log on and do some work, pick them up when they're ready. That's absolutely convenient. But I think what the major thing the gig economy and these platforms are doing are responding to one central thing. And that's that traditionally, people are making the same amount of money today as they were decades ago. But we all know that costs of everything is increasing exponentially. At the same time, people still need access to those goods and services more than ever. And so what really these applications do are create a very convenient way for people to access cheaper goods and services, to access work that pay them less. And those very same people that are paid less require services that are cheaper than traditionally, right? And so there's an argument to be made that if people were being paid better, had access to more money, if the cost of living was lower, you would be able to afford a little bit more. And so really it's responding to two needs. People are making a little bit of money or not as much as before. It's hard to keep up with cost of living, so people need to work more, but people are making less, so they work more. They make less, so they need to access things that are cheaper, right? So that it's a really cyclical way of perpetuating wages staying down. And so for us, we're not against technology, and I don't think we need to be. I think what has to be challenged is what it's being used for and whether or not the money being made on these platforms is distributed in a fair and equitable fashion.
How's the gig economy impacting the union? Is it changing the issues that you're working on or the way that you're organizing?
Absolutely. Well, I think technology and the onset of technology provides opportunities to us as well to organize, to access workers, to use the same tools to make sure people are connecting with their organization that's meant to protect them. It's challenging in that our workplaces where we have contracts technology is being used to displace or disrupt the work, and so what we're seeing is the downward trend of employing less people to do the same work. And again, that's a challenging thing because it is putting people out of work that may have good paying jobs, and asking them to either enter the workplace or workforce, to look for work with the skill sets they have. And they look for work where that work may exist but no longer pay them in the same way. And that really is what we're seeing in terms of a challenge in our traditional spaces. But as a whole, we're also seeing the gig economy as a way for employers to circumvent labor law. Really, that's the number one thing that it's doing, because the work isn't disappearing. We have workplaces where the workforce may be even larger than it was before in the past. The problem is the vast majority are only accessing very little hours, very little pay, and no benefits or legal protections at all. And that's where we see that the biggest challenge is how do we represent them if they're not employees? Under the law, to represent workers as a union, they have to be deemed employees because they have to be able to join a union as employees. And you need that employer then to actually abide by the rules or the contract that you eventually negotiate. And so the use of these tools, sure, is a way to keep unions out, but at the same time, it's also a way to keep people out of accessing their rights.
And does it make it harder, or does it change the way that you access those workers as a union? I mean, presumably if they were employed in a formal workplace and coming to work at the same times, and it may be easier to organise them then than it might be if they're in these more looser forms of relationship with their employers.
I mean, I think there's workers everywhere, no matter what kind of workplace it is, that are really against unions, but there's also a plethora of workers that are realizing the value and that are desirous of having union representation. In terms of accessing them, I guess the caveat is that now there's no employer, so you can sign cards without intimidation about the worry of being reprimanded. That's theoretically what should happen, but our Uber campaign illustrates that that's not the case, that Uber drivers are very concerned about signing a card, that they're still getting information or being told not to, or being scared by or being put pressure on by whether it's insurance companies or ancillary companies that work with the applications themselves. There's still fear of losing their jobs. And so it's easier in that there's no employer's watchful eye. It's easier in that people have, you have an ability to speak to them in a more free and open way than you might with traditional employers, because you can't just walk into a workplace and start talking union, whereas in an Uber or Skip the Dishes, somebody delivers food to your door, you're able to have a conversation in a better way with them about their rights. And so it's interesting because it also, the digital space is one that now allows us to contact people instantly. We're able to grow our movement a lot more. We've had people signing cards across the country electronically without ever speaking to somebody, expressing that they'd like to have union protection, that they need benefits, or they need access to pension or health and safety provisions. And so that's happening daily. I'm sure as we've spoken, we've received emails of workers in the digital space, specifically working for gig and platform employers, that are signing cards. And so it is unique in that they're finding us more than ever before, where traditionally we had to find where workers were and where they might want to join the union.
So presumably, you're using technology now to allow workers to connect with you, and for you to reach out and organise, to provide information, and can you describe a little bit about what you're doing with technology?
Absolutely. So I mean, gone are the days where we show up at people's doors and say, hey, this is what's happening in your workplace. Would you like to sign a union card? Today, what we see is workers finding us through social media. We're using tools, the digital tools, more like ever before. One of the most popular tools are texting applications that we know people like Bernie Sanders use to really create a groundswell of support for his campaign. And so we're using some of those tools to instantly engage and instantly poll and survey workers, whether that's to get information from them or give information out. We're using these type of tools as well, right? Making sure that our digital meeting spaces are taking place, so that we've had meetings with hubs of workers across Canada using new technology. And while people in the classroom might laugh and say, these are new, like these are normal technologies, in the workplace workplace advocacy space, unfortunately, we've taken a while to start using and implementing these tools. But now that we're seeing greater growth than ever before. And there's a necessity, because what we're seeing is today's challenging of worker rights is leading to a lot more people realizing they need more protection than ever before.
Makes sense. And so, do you think that technology is having an impact on the issues that unions are going to be focusing on in the future? In the past, they'll have focused on terms and conditions and other things. Mm-hmm. Do you think in the future that technology and the changing nature of work is going to mean that the things that are important to unions will change?
I don't think that the things that are important will necessarily change. I think at the core of what we do, I think it's very important to state is you'll often hear companies and businesses and industries talk about things like wanting to be flexible, wanting to be agile, wanting to make money and be profitable, wanting to secure their long-term longevity, sustainability, their ability to grow. We say that's great. Businesses should absolutely have that right. What we believe, though, is that human beings, people, you and I, it shouldn't be outrageous that we want the exact same things. If these businesses are able to ask for that, people should as well. And so those core beliefs I don't think will ever disappear. I think we also say that those big businesses, those industries, those employers, they have the framework and the support of a lot of money to do the legal work, to do the advocacy, to do the law changes and making or put pressure on governments necessary to get what they'd like. Individuals, however, don't have that. And so there's a need to collectivize and actually bring together people in industries, businesses that work for specific employers, so they have access to a pooled resource so they can challenge some of those bigger entities. So I don't think that will change. What we say when it comes to technology is that if disruption happens, and it is inevitably happening, that there be something called just transition, that people be given opportunities either to train up to use the new technology that's brought into workplaces, or to have an opportunity to transition out of their workplace. I don't think it's unreasonable for people to be asked that if I'm being replaced by a machine or technology that does my work or can do it better, that when I'm let go of, that there is some respect in that process, right? Whether that's a proper severance package, whether that's trying to see first and foremost if they can be retrained. And so those are some of the important things to us. Technology is transforming work, it's transforming how it's done, it's eliminating some jobs, but in other cases it's actually creating new type of work. And so for us, that's where we see the opportunity to make sure people are transitioned into that work. We're not against technology, and I don't think many unions should, or and if they do, I wouldn't necessarily be in agreement with them. What I think is that at the end of the day, people need to be recognized as individuals and as the core of our society, and they need support. And it's okay to ask for that support, whether that's in, again, transitioning into a new job, or whether that's transitioning out of work because technology has had an impact. I'll give you an example. We have some manufacturing facilities where we once employed 800 to 1,000 workers that all got paid substantially over minimum wage, who all had pension plans, benefits, who could raise a family with this job, right? Not necessarily living even comfortably or even rich, but being able to make enough to subsist, to live. With some new technological changes, those same factories today, rather than employ 800, employ 60 employees, and are able to produce double and make more profits, and that's great for the company. But I'd ask that we consider the people that lost their jobs, and that really that's at the core of what we do. And so we've created programs to retrain, to reclassify, to get them credentials so they can move to other workplaces. And so our focus now, when it comes to technology, isn't necessarily stopping it. It's making sure that the impact is one that's done in a way that we call or term just.
So in some of those things that you've described are presumably new for the union, or meaning you're doing more of those things than you might have done in the past, particularly around technological change and changes that companies might be making. So you've been looking as a union at what you need to do to support workers during that change.
Absolutely. One of the biggest impacts we see with new technology is, especially as it is used in facilities where we've had long-term contracts, is that a lot of people that are being put out of work are people that have been in work for 20, 30 years, that are close to retirement, that have really put in their time. And I always like to tell people, most people get upset if they go to a Tim Hortons line and are waiting for 5-10 minutes and somebody butts the line. People start looking around saying, hey, buddy, why are you cutting the line? And yet when it comes to work, people don't value that same thing. They forget that that person that has 20 or 30 years working in a workplace might look at the person that comes in the first day and has a better pay or better work conditions or better benefits or whatever the case may be, and say, well, I've been here 30 years of my life, and so if you're going to use technology to knock me out of a job, 30 years of life is a long time. It should mean something, especially when it comes to the multi-billion-dollar industries. And I think this is the misconception with unions, is that people believe that we want to take the billions away. And what we're asking for is those billions can turn into dollars in the hundreds, maybe thousands for people, and that money is really meaningful for a person that's let go of because of technology changes in the workplace. And so for us, we're always trying to protect people in that way. It's an interesting caveat of how to look at seniority, because it always interests me a lot that people are quick to get mad at somebody skipping the line when it's about 30 minutes of your life. But when it's about 25 or 30 years of somebody's life, we forget that people should have access to that benefit or protection of their position in line, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we often underestimate the capability of people to retrain in new jobs.
Exactly.
Whatever age they might be. I mean,
exactly.
Early in my career, I was involved with a program where we were looking at retraining of people in robotics and electronics and things like that. And we had people in their 60s retraining very successfully, more successfully often than people who were younger. Mm-hmm. So to push aside the people who are there now and
exactly.
not allow them access to these new areas
exactly.
is pretty short-sighted. It's not good for the company either.
And I don't think it's good for our society either that treat people as they get older worse. I think the reality is that people forget, and probably a lot of people watching today, that sooner or later you'll be older. And sooner or later somebody younger comes in. And there's always, always, always somebody that could do your job better, somebody that could do it faster, somebody who's willing to do it cheaper. And that's why it's important that we protect everybody, right? Because it's not a race to the bottom. And if you think it's okay that you take somebody else's job because you can do it better, faster, quicker, then we have to be okay when somebody can do it better, faster, quicker, and cheaper than us. And I don't think that should be the case, especially when you work in places that can definitely afford to pay for decent wages.
Absolutely. I got two final questions.
Absolutely.
The first one is the role of government in the gig economy. Some governments, like California, have been creating new regulation around the gig economy, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what's going on in Canada and what you think government should be doing as far as gigs concerned.
So I think part of the problem with the onslaught of technological change and disruption is that legislators and legislation generally takes a long time to be formed, to be perfected, to be crafted, to be thought about. And technology, as we all know, waits for no one. And so when we look at the gig platform and these applications that have come to the marketplace, legislators across Canada or across North America have had to legislate retroactively. So the company comes, sets up shop, starts operating, and then they realize, oh wait, there's some parameters here we didn't consider. And so across Canada, for the most part, where rideshare services already operate or where these applications are being used, in the most part, there is no legislation that really covers them. Really, the circumvention of that employer-employee relationship is the biggest circumvention to access any real legislation. So we know that municipal governments here in Toronto had to recently revise their ride-hailing services, and so there was a consultation period that took place. We actively took place in that space to make sure that we put forward what we were hearing from Uber drivers, like the need to make sure that, if people are driving you around, it's not a bad thing that they need an extra level of a driver's license. Maybe, right? I mean, I think when we talk about safety, when we talk about all these things, it's not bad to make sure people are capable of doing the work that they're being signed up to do. I think that's a safety question. We put forward suggestions like a mandatory training that will be rolled out in the next 2 years in Toronto for Uber drivers and ride-hailing services. I don't think that's a bad thing, that people get trained to do the work that they're going to perform. And so there's legislation like that's being considered, BC, the province of BC, has had the opportunity to actually consider and put forward legislation before these applications come to market, specifically ride-hailing services. So they were able to mandate any ride-hailing service that opens has to have a higher level of license, has to get training, and a couple of other things that they're considering right now before they open up shop, if you will. And that's important because retroactive legislation is almost near impossible to enact, because by the time you try to, the operators have been operating for so long, the brand grows, and the brand's power in society also is one that's difficult for governments to want to contest. And that's where our space comes up, right? So we're challenging certain laws. We're involved in the Ontario Supreme Court to challenge Uber in recognizing the fact that today, if an Uber driver in Ontario has an issue with Uber, they're forced to pay $14,000 and use what's called their arbitration clause that takes place in the Netherlands. And so if I got robbed $1,000 off my paycheck, my legal way of getting help is paying $14,000, going to the Netherlands to hear my case. And so that's currently being heard under the Supreme Court today in Ontario to challenge that, to say that that's unconscionable, that's unreasonable, and it alienates what are supposed to be Canadian labor laws from the worker. And so that's really what we're trying to do, is return that back so that workers have access to protections. And sure, maybe you work and you don't have an issue, but because one person doesn't have an issue doesn't mean we ignore the people that do. And so laws are taking a lot longer, and what we're seeing in California, the same thing. It's had to be drivers and people or nonprofit organizations, some unions that have put together some demands and pressured the government to understand that there are some holes and some gaps in what's happening with legislation. And again, it's not to stop companies, because that's often what's said, or this quick conception that treating people right equals I'm going to have to pay more for my service. And I don't think, and we've said it since we launched our campaign, that respect and dignity should cost dollars and cents. And if respect and dignity put businesses out of work, or put businesses out of business, maybe they shouldn't have been operating in the first place. I think healthy business models that treat people well are not a bad thing. And so law and legislation hasn't kept up. We're putting pressure across the country, across North America. We're seeing court cases being won, classifying drivers or delivery people as employees. And of course the business doesn't like it, because ultimately that means dollars and cents. But it also means money in the pocket of workers and people. And so we're about balance. And I think balance is an important thing in anything we do. And so we'll continue to fight for that at the legislative level, but we know that there's a lot of work left to do. And unfortunately, the division of how things are in Canada means that some things you have to challenge at the municipal level, some things have to be challenged at the provincial level, like labor laws, and some things have to be challenged at the federal level. And perhaps that's really the difficulty here, is that this technology really has no borders, and unfortunately legislation generally does.
Plenty of work for you to do. My last question is, for the people who'll be watching this, most of them are going to be students at the University of Waterloo and perhaps elsewhere. Have you got any words of advice for them as they become workers themselves and join the workforce?
Absolutely. I would say a couple of things. First off is you hit the nail on the head in that we often forget that we're all workers. Whether you're working at a fast food store, whether you're working in a grocery store, doing delivery, using these apps, whether you're somebody that's self-contracted and have a skill that you sell, whether it's artistic or otherwise that you're able to monetize, what you're selling is your labor, your work. And what we often say is all work needs to be respected. Whether you're the DJ that makes $100 for an hour gig, whether you're that grocery worker, or whoever you are, and whatever you do, even if you're doing consultation work, you're still a worker. And people that do work merit, and actually by law, should be protected by labor rights. I would say that we also have to remember that our colleagues, our friends, our families are workers, because often when business decisions are made at the very highest level, we reduce people to numbers, to dollars and cents, to costs. And while that might be fine, we have to remember that for every time you might do that, somebody else higher than you is looking down at you and trying to figure out your dollars and cents. And while that's nice in the business world, there's still a need to have provisions to protect people so that even when people are let go of, when they're transferred, when they're retrained, that things are done in a fair manner, in an equitable manner. I would say when it comes to technology specifically, a lot of people have different concepts of what might happen. In today's society, we live in a society where most things are geared towards increasing and maximizing profit and reducing cost. In that reality, technology isn't really being used to better people's lives, to make sure they're able to afford things more, to make sure they really and truly have more flexibility. And so we have to ask ourselves, when technology is being used, what is it being used for? Who is it that's creating the technology? And what's your ultimate goal with this technology? Simply being convenient isn't solving people's ability to actually participate in society meaningfully. So there's a bunch of models that you could look at that actually offer cooperative models, and I'm not saying that's the answer, but that return more of the share of rides or services to the people creating or giving those services. Those models, at the very least, embedded in their models are the concept of wanting to return more of what people do back to them. Those things are empowering. But when your dollars and cents equation with technology is about minimizing cost, minimizing the amount of people that work, minimizing labor, you have to question the impact that ends up having in society as a whole. And so I always tell people, when I'm on the highway driving, I always like to think, when you want to change lanes, I'm going to let you change lanes. Because I'd hope that when I need to change lanes, you would do the same. And when we do any of the work that we do, whether it's my advocacy, whether it's your work in whatever industry you end up working in, you have that choice to make. How do you participate in society? And what role do you want to really take? We have an opportunity. Technology might provide us that opportunity. But it's how we use it, why we use it, where we use it, and what ultimately we want to accomplish with it that we have to always consider.
A great message to end on, that we should be using technology to provide people with dignity and respect at work, or in ways that allow people to have dignity and respect at work, to provide good rather than simply to increase the profits of organizations. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today, Pablo, and to the other people who will be watching this. It is very valuable to get a greater understanding of the impact of technology on people at work, and again, thank you for doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me anytime.